thank you for coming to our annual Darwin Day event. Small crowd, but we're happy to have everyone. We're happy to have Dr. Colin Hughes speak with us today, and he is going to, we're going to do this in a sort of a conversational format. So we're going to turn it over to Dr. Colin Hughes. Thank you.
So what I wanted to do today was sort of like a couple of things, I guess. I wanted to first talk about what Charles Darwin's major contribution was, and then a little bit about how, even though we remember him, as being this really influential guy, how we actually don't really remember him correctly, and how it would probably be better if we changed our ideas about that as a society. It's obviously not everybody who misremembers him. Who recognizes these people? Apart from Darwin, of course, who I gave pride of place. This guy was an Austrian man called Gregor Mendel. He went into being a monk and eventually got to be an abbot of a monastery. But when he was there, he sort of had a mathematical physics background from university. When he was there, he started growing plants, pea plants, and everyone knows a little bit about genetics now, right? But this guy, working in the mid-1800s, he's the father of that whole way of thinking. Sadly, though, everyone forgot about his work until 1900, and then it was actually other people independently came up with the same ideas, but then they read Mendel's original papers, and to their credit, they said, look, Mendel discovered this in 1856. So he's credited as being the father of genetics. This is Louis Pasteur, who worked in France, and he figured out that microbes caused disease, right? So prior to that, people thought it was like bad air and stuff, right, that led people to get sick. What an incredible way of changing. Like, everyone knows that microbes, right? It's just a commonly known thing, yeah. But that idea actually had its origin with Louis Pasteur. This is Alexander von Humboldt, who was a German sort of low-level aristocrat, and he, as a very young man, spent the part of the fortune that he had inherited on this incredible trip to South America, where he came up generally with the idea that all of these things in nature were interconnected. They played roles that were important to other things in biology. So he is really the father of ecology. So when we think about the interdependence of organisms and how ecosystems have a sort of a function, it's really this guy who we're thinking about, Alexander von Humboldt. And though these two met, they only met for a very brief time. I don't think any of the others. Darwin apparently received one of Mendel's papers, but as far as anyone can tell, he never read it. So that left him devoid of any real understanding of genetics, which was a shame. And I don't think that there were any other pairwise meetings. But von Humboldt, when he visited England after he'd sort of become the most famous scientist of his time, he visited England and visited Darwin. But as far as I read it, I don't think they would have liked each other very much. Von Humboldt seemed to be like this incredibly active guy. Like, he did amazing amounts of work. He seems to have gotten no sleep. And he would go out. After dinner, he'd go out and go around various different parties to meet people. Sometimes he'd do some work when he came home. He'd get up at 5 the next morning and start working on one of his projects. Whereas Darwin was really sort of like a sort of slow and steady worker. And any of you who have looked at parts of or read the whole thing On the Origin of Species, you'll see that he really had a much more methodical kind of approach. That was his one thing. So what an amazing time. This is sort of the mid to late 1800s. And all of this stuff that like just 50 years prior was completely, no one had any idea about it. it's all sort of traces to these amazing people, This is sometimes called Darwin's orchid. And it's sort of a really great demonstration of just how his kind of thinking has seeped into the popular mind, right? On his trip, Darwin discovered this orchid. And one of the weird things about this orchid is that you see this long spur on the back of the flower here. That's where it makes nectar, is at the very tip of that spur here. And Darwin's reasoning was that there must be some insect with a 10 or 12 inch long tongue that can pollinate this flower, because that was how he had come to think about nature. And people just laughed at it, right? That, you know, what a ridiculous idea that there would be an insect with a tongue so long that it could reach the nectar at the end of this. You know, this was just how God had created it. Darwin's thinking was totally different. But if I told you guys that there must be an insect with a 10-inch long tongue, that you're very surprised. You'd probably say, yeah, that kind of makes sense, right? And there is. It's a large moth, which was only discovered relatively recently. The flower has been known for quite a long time, but it's great, isn't it? Oh, it is, isn't it? It's fabulous, isn't it? It's moth pollinated, so it has a scent, but it doesn't pump out scent until the evening. So right now you won't be able to smell it, I'm afraid. But this is sort of Darwin's orchid. So I think a really great demonstration of how his thinking is just seeped into every day. So this idea of evolution was in the air, right? But and so the idea that organisms would change over time didn't originate with Darwin. That is not his big contribution, right? So this is from one of Darwin's notebooks that was, in his house, and it makes the main point, I think, right, that all of life has a single origin. All of the diversity that we are familiar with has just a single origin, and it has arisen not just from change over time, but from branching itself. Okay, so what I was trying to illustrate with this really terrible hand-drawn thing, right, is that this idea of change over time, if you thought about changes in shape as being their x-axis and time as the y-axis, that had been sort of, that was in the air, but people thought that these things had been created as types and change had happened. What Darwin said was no. There was just a single origin, and through this branching pattern, it led to all of the diversity that we see on the Earth. Okay. So that was. Yeah.
I was told a long time ago that the first humans came from the ocean. They were like this big. Is that true? Humans?
Well, so let's say we thought that if I could just put some concrete examples on the tips here, right? So let's say D here was humans, right? And if you went back in evolutionary time, back along this track, at some point you would find the ancestor of humans and monkeys, for example. Now, what would you call that animal? What would you call that animal? At some point, there was an animal that was alive, and on one path of the tree, it went to monkeys. On another path, it went to humans. What would you call the animal that was the progenitor of those two? It's obviously not right to call it a human, right? And it's not right to call it a monkey either. Monkey is our name for everything that's alive today that looks like that. Now, for sure, it would have looked like what we call, a monkey or an ape. So, if you went back farther in time, you would find the ancestor of all of the organisms that have 4 limbs, the things that are called tetrapods. So us and hippos and zebras and lizards and turtles and stuff like that, right? the ancestor of all of those was some kind of fish, right? But I would never have called it a human. It's certainly one of my. It's on in my ancestral lineage. But to say that, I think it's sort of misleading to say that humans came from fish, right? If you traced our ancestry far enough back, you would find that the origin of the tetrapods was marine. Yeah, there was a marine animal that many. So that was in the Devonian, I think. So it's like 400 million years or something, really long time ago. Until before, if you.
had that many ancestors.
Huh?
I know I had that many ancestors.
Well, so it's not difficult, right? So you think everyone has parents, right? And all your parents, they have parents, right? And what Darwin's claim is that this is just an unbroken chain going back, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents and stuff. But extending that, we tend to think in terms of just a few hundred years, maybe 1,000 years or so. Well, we are talking 1,000 years, 1,000 years. And that is many generations of things. So as you go along one of these back in time, it is really a lot of generations of things. Yeah, that was one thing that all life is sort of unified in this pattern. Then the other big thing is why it happens. Natural selection. So Darwin didn't just come up with that idea of a tree. He came up with the mechanism behind it. Why does that happen? He could explain that, and did so in great detail in his book. Natural selection is one of the things that is most poorly remembered, most inaccurately remembered at this moment. So if you were to think of what is the sort of handy-dandy way of thinking about natural selection?
Survival of the fittest.
Everyone. Survival of the fittest. That's kind of almost an empty phrase, right? What are the fittest? It's the ones that are better adapted to their environment or better surviving. Now you've got to the point that it's the survival of the ones that are better at surviving. Well, yeah, right? That is true, of course, because that's circular reasoning, right? But it doesn't have to be that, right? You can actually think about natural selection in a much more sort of analytic way, and I think it's just a much more useful way. Natural selection is just what happens when four things are true. You choose some characteristic that you're interested in studying, and you think, there's got to be variation in that characteristic. I'm going to go through this because this is Darwin's biggest thing, right? I'm going to go through it with one specific example, then we'll choose a human example, okay? In general, there has to be variation in that characteristic. That, at least in part, that characteristic has to be able to be passed on to your offspring. It has to have a genetic background to it. There are certain things that don't have a genetic basis. Can you think of one? Mm-hmm. Things that you don't pass on to your kids genetically. Language, I think, is a really great example, right? You know, it's not. Certainly, your kids typically speak the language that you do, but it has no genetic basis.
Belief in superstition.
Sorry?
Belief in superstition.
Yeah, that's a hard one. And religion is another one, right? Children typically resemble. Most people just get their religion from their parents, right? But there's no genetic basis to that. You know, if the kids were adopted from China to the United States, they would just grow up with a different religion. So the second one is that trait has to be passed on to offspring. The third one seems almost trivial because this is always true, right? Like, it is really hard to imagine an organism where there is no variation in reproduction. The only time I've tried to think about this, I think the only example of this that I can think of is that in zoos, when they bring animals into captivity, they want to make sure that those animals don't adapt to the zoo environment. They don't evolve in a way that makes them domestic, especially if they want to re-release them into the wild. You know, like with the California condors, for example, that they brought in. They didn't want to want them to evolve to become domestic. The ones that were calm in front of humans would have, would do better. No, they don't want that. So what they try and do is they make sure that every one in that captivity has the same number of offspring. And that, if that's true, if every individual has the same number of offspring, there is no natural selection. So, that has to be true. And then the fourth is really the nub of this, right? Is that the number of individuals that an organism has to be related to the presence of some version of the variant. Okay, so that's it in general. Let me give you a specific example. So this is far and away the best known. Has anyone here read that common book, the sort of like common science book, The Beak of the Finch? It tells this story in great detail. This is a small bird from the Galapagos called the medium ground finch. It's one of Darwin's finches. They are really dull and boring. You can see that this male is part of the study because some bird biologist has put bracelets on it so that you can recognize individuals. Okay, so this particular study was a study of beak size of these finches. That was the characteristic that was being studied, right? So, number one, beak size has to vary. So, yes, some finches have larger beaks than others. Larger beaks have larger beaked birds have larger beaked offspring. It's heritable. Some finches survived over a drought period and some didn't. And it was the larger beaked birds that survived better than the smaller beaked birds. Given that, what do you expect happened in the following generation?
There's even more larger beaks.
On average, beak size was higher, right? It's obvious. It just has to be true, right? Beak size varies. It's passed on to offspring. It turns out there was variation in survival. In this particular case, the larger beaks survived better. So in the next generation of finches, you would expect beak size to be bigger than it had been before. Every one of those steps was carefully documented. So you can catch these birds and you just measure their beak size. But we're not terribly good at seeing this, right? When you look at a whole flock of grackles or whatever it is, it's not like you notice that some of them have slightly longer beaks or deeper beaks, right? But if you go out and catch them and measure them, yeah, look at this. Beak size varies. If you measure the beak size of the parents and you compare it to the beak size of the offspring, yeah, small-beaked parents have small-beaked offspring. Medium-beaked parents have medium-beaked offspring. And big-beaked, on average, big-beaked parents have big-beaked offspring. Yeah, it gets passed on. It's no great shakes, right? It's just, I think this is though survival of the fittest is an empty kind of phrase, right? It's almost like duh when you think about natural selection in this way, with these sort of analyzing as these four parts, then it seems like obvious. This is variation in here. So the variation in number of surviving offspring you produce is a product of two things: how long you live, and also how many offspring you have in each reproductive event, right? So if you don't survive to even reproduce once, of course you have zero. If you only nest one time as a finch, maybe you'll have 3 offspring. But if you survive the next year, you have 3 more, and if you survive again, right? So it's a combination of these two things of survival. This particular story actually hinges mostly on survival, because what happened in I guess at the beginning of 1775, was there was a huge El Nino event in the La Nina event. It was a huge La Nina event in the Galapagos, and it really didn't rain. And so the plants didn't produce any seeds, and the finches started starving to death. The population plummeted to somewhere around a couple of hundred. 1,200 of the finches died on this particular island. So some survived, most of them died. Darwin actually chose that phrase, natural selection, to contrast it with a process that was already well known called artificial selection, where people had chosen crop plants or domestic livestock for particular desirable characteristics, like lots of milk or producing lots of seeds or something.
So really the process was already known.
And Darwin spent a lot of time with pigeon fanciers, people who did a lot of breeding of pigeon strains in England after he got back. Yeah, to understand more about the process. Yes. So his insight, of course, was that this was the general process that worked in nature. Yeah. So this is the outcome, right? Before the drought, this was the average beak size, and after the drought, the average beak size was bigger. No great shakes, but to us today, but that was Darwin's insight. That is natural selection. There's nothing mysterious about it. It's just the obvious, necessary outcome when all four of those things are true. Okay, so here's what people are actually really interested in, right? Are humans still evolving? Now, in order to go through this, let's pick it. What do people really mean when they say, are humans still evolving? I think they have a more specific question in mind.
Height.
I don't think that's it.
I think the people that are asking this are asking, are we changing into a different species? Because they're trying to...
I don't think that's quite it either.
Are we going to turn into that character, like an alien with a big head and the big eyes?
Are we different than somebody else?
Brain size.
Yeah, I think that it's mostly and it's related to this aliens with the giant head thing. I think that this is it, right? I think that mostly when people ask that question, are humans still evolving? What they're really interested in is, are we going to be even smarter and much better than the animals in the future? That's what they really want to know. So to go through this process of asking about natural selection, you have to choose a characteristic. So let's say it's being smart. That's what we're really interested in, is, are humans getting smarter at the moment? So it's those four things. Is there variation in how smart people are?
Yes, of course. Yes.
There is. There's a lot of variation, right? There is variation that we're probably not very interested in. Football players with brain trauma, for example, we know that that's not a product of their genes or anything like that. And there are people with problems during development, right? Where even if we excluded people like that, we just took ordinary people. And psychologists have done this for years and years and years, right? They've just measured people's IQ, a general measure of intelligence. Now, obviously, it's still a very controversial area in psychology, but there is no psychologist would argue against there being some variation in intelligence. Okay. Number 2. Is it passed on to offspring? Now, this gets to this issue of probably some change is due to better nutrition, not having childhood diseases and stuff. But do smart parents, this is the average smart of mom and dad, do they, on average, have smart kids?
You can't answer that yes or no. Smarter parents send their kids to better schools. Better schools yield smarter students.
So let's say you could control for that.
It's environmental and genetic.
So let's say you could control for that. You could take just a specific school, the same school, and you could take a cohort of children who enroll there. You could measure the intelligence of their parents and the intelligence of their kids. So these things can be measured. Is intelligence passed on to offspring? This is actually something that psychologists have studied a ton, right? One of the strongest lines of evidence comes from studies of adoptions of twins. These are studies called twins raised apart. I just think it's an unbelievably cruel thing to have done, but they would adopt twins out separately to separate families. And then you can look at, do the twins resemble each other in their general IQ, right? They've had entirely different upbringings, and so presumably quality of school and quality of nutrition and incidence of disease and so on, that should just add to the noise, but not to the signal in this particular case. It shouldn't introduce a bias. What do those studies show? Yeah, it shows that intelligence is actually quite a lot heritable. You really do pass on. If you have smart parents, they really are much more likely to have smart kids. And parents who are sort of on the low end of the IQ scale are much more likely to have kids who are on the low end of this IQ scale. So yes, there's really good evidence for this in humans. Some individuals have more surviving offspring than others. That's almost always true. Like, who in this room is an only child? One. Who has one sibling? Who has two siblings? Anyone with more than two siblings?
Wow. Represent.
So
Married to each other.
So this is as I said, this is kind of a duh. The number of offspring an individual has depends on which variant of the characteristic they have. And so our characteristic here is intelligence, and let's just say it comes in two forms, high and low. There just has to be an average difference in the number of surviving offspring that high and low intelligence people have. It turns out that in this country, people with lower IQ have more kids.
True.
Correct.
The consequence of that will be...
They will have less
Double
smart
populace.
children. There are
Sorry?
more children.
In the next generation, average IQ will be low. Is this evolution, right? With this example about how smart humans are, we all agree with these things. We all agree that the logical outcome has to be that the next generation will be lower IQ. Is that evolution? It is evolution. That's right. That is evolution by natural selection. That is evolution by natural selection.
You say, so should we interrupt it? Do something about it?
That's a political thing, right? That's not science. That's a society can make those kinds of decisions, right? I'm going to get to your point. What difference does it make what the variance is, right? So here's the difference, right? If smart people on average had 2.2 offspring, and dumb people had on average 2.3 offspring per family, this process would go really slowly. But if smart people had on average just one child, and dumb people had on average 10 kids per family, this process would go really fast. That's the relevance to that. So to get back to your question of a while ago, it affects the rate that this happens.
So
this is the scala naturae, the ladder of life, which goes from like inanimate stuff, plants, flowering plants, things like jellyfish, all the way up through birds, then mammals, and then right at the tip, yes, humans. This is a really old idea. This goes back to Romans at least. So it's a pretty ancient idea. Though I don't know about the cartoon. This idea was widely associated with Lamarck in his work.
Hello.
But so this is one of the ways. This is one of the common ways that we really misremember what Darwin's work was about. Darwin's work was just about change over time. It didn't have a goal. It was just change over time. And I think if you want to think about this in a sort of in a really concrete way to help, I think this is a really great example, which you guys are probably familiar with. Everyone know what this is?
A minnow?
This is called the blind cave fish. This is a species. This is a species found in Mexico, and there's actually a whole bunch in this area of Mexico which has limestone caves, a lot of which are subterranean. Many of them have these populations of fish, and their closest living relatives are just swimming around the streams up above. This is a product of evolution. When those sighted fish find themselves in underground caves, there's absolutely no advantage to having eyes. And if you could save yourself the energy of making eyes, you can put that energy into having eggs. So in the caves, these animals produce a larger number of eggs because they're not wasting energy making eyes. And so when these fish get into the caves, they evolve to be blind. It's not getting better in any particular way. It makes sense, I think, right? That they don't need eyes. Why waste the energy making an eye? But it's a nice concrete example of how things don't advance in the way that cartoon sort of strongly suggests that they should. Here's another one that all evolutionary biologists hate. This happens in every darn nature show. If someone says that such and such an event happens for the good of the species, cave fish getting blind is not for the good of the species. This is not what it happens. It happens because those four things, those four parts of natural selection are true. A good example of for the good of the species is these guys, and some of you may have heard about this. Do you know about male lions?
Yeah.
Male lions, when they take over a new pride of females, they kill the offspring. So in lions, the stable part of the social group is the group of females, right? And the males are sort of wandering around the periphery, and some males will be loosely associated with each pride, but of course every male wants to be associated with pride, so they fight for access to the prides. And if new males come in, kill the males that are here already, the first thing they do is kill all the cubs. Because that way the females come into estrus sooner and they have more offspring. It's good for the male lions. That sucks for the lionesses, right? And it sucks for lions as a whole. But it's good for the male lions, right? It only works within a population, and you always got to ask yourself, is it good for the individual? It's not, they really don't care about the species. Nothing ever cares about the species. This is a sort of an extension of this. I think this is even part of a book. The elimination of inferior species gradually over time. Oh, no. The way natural selection works is within a population. It just makes that population more adapted to its environment. That's all it does. It's a population level phenomenon. Now, of course, if it works in a population it does particularly well, then that population may well spread out and it could easily displace other species. But that's not the crux of it. No. The crux of it is change over time within a population. Okay, I've been run on for too long here. So
You're good. Keep going. Please.
I am going to leave it there. But,
I have a question.
Yeah.
Where does maybe and I don't know if fast forward's the right term, but mutation of an offspring, does that fast forward something, or does that? I know it can obviously hinder someone, but I'm sure a creature it could help them in certain instances.
Let me go to this. Go back to the very general one up here. So there's variation among individuals in a characteristic. That variation has to be sort of born at some time, right? I mean, if you think about every origin of each individual species, there is a small population, and eventually they become a whole species. Right? Where does the variation within that species come from? So that if you think about a population, and you can ask the question, how is it evolving? Where did the variation come from? The origin of all variation is mutation, but it's a really, really rare process. If you're interested in the incredibly long time span that evolution has happened, then mutation is incredibly important. But if what you're interested in is from this generation to the next, mutation is such a tiny thing that, no. There is one other source of variation, actually, in populations, which is important, particularly important in this country.
Diversity?
It's immigration. Yeah. Yeah. So the amount of variation within your population can be augmented by immigration, and so that provides much more fertile variation for natural selection to work on. If you think about the kind of people who immigrate, right, it's often the people with more money elsewhere, right? Like, of course, I'm speaking as an immigrant here, who grew up poor, actually. So it's just on average, right? But on average, I would think that the people who can get here, like, look at Venezuela, for example. Like, every damn rich Venezuelan lives in Florida now, because their own country is such an awful place to live, and the same is true for a lot of places, right? And my guess is that a lot of them were, well above the average intelligence for the country. I did see a really interesting speculation in a paper just this week or last week, and it was about, people often say that it would be nice if our country was more like the Scandinavian countries, sort of let's all get along, work together for the common good, whereas here it's so individualistic. The speculation was maybe we're more individualistic because individualistic personalities have moved from there to here. So it has two effects. One is it fills up this country with individualistic personalities, but it strips them out of Scandinavia, perhaps leading... So that was the speculation in the paper, and I didn't have time to read it in detail. But the speculation was maybe these Nordic countries are all, have really great social systems and social cohesiveness simply because those were the people who were left behind. But it gets to your issues, to the point you exactly raise, that there are differences in personality, and it strongly points to figuring this out about that. And that would be a really hard thing to do nowadays when we don't do twins raised apart, right? Because certainly your character is hugely dependent on your childhood, your parents, and your and the sort of community you grow up in. Have you heard the story of the man who eventually became his competitor, Alfred Russel Wallace? So Alfred Russel Wallace was a contemporary of Darwin's, but he grew up poor. Darwin grew up rich. He grew up poor, and in order to make a living, he went abroad and he went collecting beautiful butterflies, for example, to send back to England just for sale, so people could, it was Victorian England, late, I guess she would have been on the phone. Yeah, it would have been Victorian England. So people could have their butterfly collections and stuff. Yeah, Brits are weird. Yeah, I draw full of butterflies, which they bought. And eventually, these things had been sourced from Borneo and places like that, where Alfred Russel Wallace was collecting. So who's making his living collecting things? He eventually noticed that when he collected the same thing from different places, they weren't exactly the same. And to read his account of this, he suffered a bout of malaria, which of course he would have contracted in the tropics, right? He suffered a bout of malaria, and when he was lying in his hammock, the vision of how those differences arose came to him, basically fully formed. And he dashed off a sort of like 2 or 3 page paper about this and sent it to Darwin, who he'd already heard about. And that was what actually freaked out Darwin, Darwin thought, damn, this guy has scooped me. I've been working for 30 years on this idea since I came back on the Beagle, and this guy has just scooped me. But Darwin had this sort of really... Darwin was always quite a quiet and retiring man, but he had kind of a bulldog, a friend, a guy called Huxley. And Huxley said, that's complete BS. We all Darwin's friends we know what you've been working on this. You should co-publish with Wallace, excuse me. And so this idea of natural selection was first presented to the Royal Society jointly by Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. But Alfred Russel Wallace had like this 2 or 3 page note that he dashed down after a feverish dream, right? Whereas Darwin had been working on this idea for like 25 years of patient plodding through. Do the data support this incredibly important idea? And so we don't really remember Wallace as being the father of natural selection. We remember Darwin, and rightly so. He certainly came to the idea earlier. So these notebooks, those little notebooks which has the I think picture in it, that was written. It was written just a couple of years after. I think it was 2 years after he got back in the Beagle. When he left the Beagle, he left in 1831. I think came back in 1836. I think that notebook is like 1837 or something. Yeah. For a man that age, right? Think of this. This is a man. He left on this trip when he was like 21, 22. Like, this is the age of my students. I'm not making that up. When I look at my students, that is the age of people who left. And he left. He was gone for nearly 5 years, away from his family and everything. The same is true for Alexander von Humboldt. He went off on his trip to South America at about age 21. And there's no mail, of course. You could potentially go, you'd end up in Montevideo or somewhere, and you could put a letter to your family on the next ship from Montevideo that was going back to Europe. And it worked. It actually worked. It actually, amazingly, that letter would get to Austria. But darn, that would have been slow, right?
What's slower than email?
This was pre-helicopter parents, right? Because Darwin's dad had funded his, without Darwin's dad's okay, Darwin himself wouldn't have had the money to, for that trip. Alexander von Humboldt had inherited quite a bit of money, and so he was able to fund his own big voyage. Okay, Rochelle.
Yes. No.
You're up.
I'm a nurse at an emergency room, and I was a first responder in New York City for 16 years, and I'm a member of FEMA's disaster response team, so I know a lot about that, and a little bit about vaccines, which are all over the news right now. Anti-Vaxxers, and you're going to get cancer and you're going to die because you're not going to have the measles. So I threw together this little slideshow about herd immunity, vaccines, and declaring a national emergency, which has nothing to do with the wall. Okay, so we did not live with dinosaurs. I don't care what Kemham tells you. We did not ride brontosauruses and use them to farm the land. If we and dinosaurs lived together, the dinosaurs would be giving the lecture right now. They would have eaten us, we'd be dead. Okay, so, big question is, what is immunity? There's basically 3 types of immunity. I'm considering a vaccine and immunity for the sake of my little talk. So we have passive immunity. Your mom, while you're growing inside of her, gives you immunity for most things except for measles. When you're born and you're a little baby, breast milk will give you some of the immunity your mother has. That is passive immunity. You did nothing to get it. It just magically showed up inside of you. Active immunity. I cough on you, I have the flu. You don't get it. Next time I cough on you with the same strain of the flu, you are immune. You have been exposed to chickenpox. You got them. Next time chickenpox came around, you don't get it. Active immunity. because you were exposed to it. Your body produced antibodies when you got the disease or a weakened form of it. When it came around again, your body said, I know what to do with this, I'm good. Active immunity. Now, vaccines. We're giving you a shot of either a dead form of the disease or really, really weakened. Your body doesn't know that it's a dead form of the disease. It's going to produce antibodies, which is why sometimes you feel a little sick when you get a flu shot. You don't really have the flu. Your body's just fighting the flu that's not there. When you're then exposed to the actual flu, your body knows what to do. You're not going to get it. So, questions? I can go on. Okay. Vaccines. They probably saved your life without you even knowing it. Very first vaccine that was produced, okay? They've been around since 1796. Edward Jenner created the vaccine for smallpox. He found that farmers who were exposed to cowpox did not get smallpox. He took the cowpox pus, which is really gross, and injected it into his own son, and then exposed his son to smallpox. His son did not get the disease. He reproduced it with a couple of other people who were volunteers. None of them got smallpox. He then said to the mass populace, we are going to inoculate you for smallpox by giving you cowpox. Uneducated farmers thought they were going to start growing tails and hooves and cow ears and udders. We all know it didn't happen. And smallpox was eradicated. Not in 1786, not in 1796, not in the 1800s, but for the most part, there is no smallpox in the world. We consider it eradicated when the prevalence of it is so small that it can't be measured.
What is cowpox?
Smallpox for cows.
Oh.
It's a cow disease. Only cows get it.
Okay.
They end up with pustulas on them because the farmers were exposed to it all the time. They weren't getting smallpox. The diseases are in the same family. I believe one is a cow disease and one is a people disease. Cows don't get smallpox. People don't get cowpox. So, I'm going to fast forward along the timeline to 1955. Okay? Jonas Salk invented an oral vaccine for polio. He just took everybody else's research that came before him and was able to really, really hone in on what was causing polio. Created a vaccine for it and said, I can either make $1 million or give it to the world for free. Gave it to the world for free. They came around in ice cream trucks and they went to neighborhoods and gave it to kids on sugar cubes. Polio is considered an eradicated disease in first world countries. You go to Haiti, lots of people have polio. Not because the vaccines aren't there, but because people are afraid to take it. You have a lot of ignorance, a lot of fear of a vaccine. Now we have polio making a comeback. Vaccines hard at work, okay? Smallpox, measles, polio, whooping cough, guinea worm disease, which we can thank Jimmy Carter for helping to eradicate. These are all diseases that, because you get a shot, you're not going to get. What if you can't get a shot? What if you are immunocompromised? What if you are allergic to what else is in the vaccine? We have herd immunity. And the basis of herd immunity is everybody on this side of the room got a measles shot. Everybody on this side of the room did not. I am the measles. And I come into the room. All of my people with the shot are going to protect these two people. Because none of you are going to get it. You can't give it to these two people. However, when people don't get vaccinated, these are the people who got the shot. These are the people who did not. I am the measles. you're all going to get sick and die. Or have horrible things happen to you with the measles. Get a shot. This is the infamous Dr. Andrew Wakefield, who penned an article for a very famous British medical journal called The Lancet, where he found 12 children, just 12, who were given vaccines. These 12 children had irritable bowel syndrome and autism. He decided to write a paper saying autism is caused by vaccines, irritable bowel syndrome is caused by vaccines. The Lancet did not do their due diligence and look for other doctors to back up the paper. Did not say, well, where's the 10,000 people you studied? And they printed it. And Jenny McCarthy said this must be true, and all the rest of Hollywood followed with it, and now the anti-vax movement has decided that vaccines cause autism. My question for them is, are they autistic? Are their parents autistic? Are their grandparents autistic? Because vaccines are why you're around. Okay, cue the lemmings. Okay, so Andrew Wakefield wrote this article. Hollywood jumped on it. The uneducated masses listened to Hollywood. And we have the anti-vax movement that was born. On the other end, we also have parents who were looking for a reason why their kids were sick. They didn't, I don't know, from the medical community as an answer. They read this article and said, the reason my child is sick is because they got a shot. If I never give another one of my kids a shot, they won't be sick. They never looked and said, I've got 2 children that have autism, one that got a shot and one that didn't. There's no correlation. Autism is what autism is. Vaccines are what vaccines are. They are not related. Ever have been, never will be, and never can be. So, November 2011, Andrew Wakefield was discredited, but the damage was already done. There's no way to take back his lie. You know, Richard Nixon, I am not a crook. He said he lied, but no one cares, the damage was done. There is now a movement called the Anti-Vax movement, where parents will not vaccinate their children. They will send them to a public school, and they will claim religious objection to vaccinating their children. They will not send them to a religious school, though. They will send their germ-ridden children to public school. These kids will have measles, whooping cough. Whooping cough is huge, and measles. The other diseases that we vaccinate against, polio, hepatitis A and B, meningitis. Meningitis will kill you within 10 days if you are not vaccinated against it. If you have it and you kiss someone's new baby, that baby will die. They have no immunity against it. They will die. You will kill someone's child. I think you know what side of the coin I fall on this one. Now, ramifications today to non-immunization. In January 17th, 2015, measles appeared at Disneyland. No one knows who patient A was because 50,000 people a day visit the happiest place on earth. And these people are from every country in the world. They are immunized, they are not immunized. They could have been carrying the disease for 10 days and not known they had it. However, they walk on the line, they touch something, you walk along the line, you touch it, the next thing you know, you're bringing measles home to your child, you're bringing measles home to school, you're bringing measles home to your workplace. In the end, over 50 cases of measles was discovered at Disneyland, all to patient A. Disneyland tried to very quietly make it go away. However, because of the internet, nothing goes away. They were days away from having to close the park and bring in the CDC to scrub the park down. However, as the numbers started to drop, Disney did what they needed to do to clean the park. Just one example of what happens when you don't inoculate. We also have Washington State, the whole state had to declare a national emergency because there were 25 cases of measles in a very, very short time. Because in Washington State, you don't need a reason to not vaccinate your children. You can just say, for philosophical reasons, I reject to vaccinating my child. And you don't have to. However, when we have pregnant women, that baby is not immune to the measles. You bring your kid to the doctor, you sit in the doctor's office, the kid's coughing, coughing, coughing. Next to you is the pregnant lady. She doesn't know your kid has the measles. Her baby's born possibly deaf, blind, deformed, because you didn't get a vaccine. So the state declared an emergency, and they are now trying their best to educate parents. We all know who he is. I didn't feel the need to. But the Department of Justice is decided that Wisconsin nursing home residents and employees can refuse a flu shot based on their philosophical belief that the flu shot is going to kill them, or the flu shot doesn't work, or the flu shot is going to give them autism or make them grow 3 heads and they're going to turn green. The problem is they work with a at-risk population. If I get the flu, I'm sick for a couple of days. If a resident of a nursing home gets the flu, there's a really good chance they're not going to survive it. Hospital employees have to get a flu shot. It's in our contract. We have no choice. If I don't want to get a flu shot, I have to wear a mask from October 1st to March 31st, whenever I am in a patient area, which is the entire hospital. I have no choice. It's in my contract. Well, once a year, I roll up my sleeve. I don't get the flu. My patients come in. They all have the flu. My question to them is, why didn't you get a flu shot? And their answer is, they don't believe in it. I tell them the same answer every single year. The flu you may not believe in the flu this year believed in you. They are sick for days. There is no cure for the flu. The medication we give you really just supports the symptoms. There's no cure for the flu. You have to just ride it out. It's a virus. Antibiotics do not work on the flu. You're going to be sick. You're going to be sick for 5 days, 10 days, 2 weeks. You may be hospitalized. There's so many, we cannot inoculate you against them all. And diseases evolve. Over time, the flu changes. There's no way to say to you, this is going to be 100% effective. We inoculate you on what the doctors think is going to be the most popular strain based on scientific theory, based on history, based on previous research. And most of the time, they're right. People who get the flu, generally speaking, were not inoculated. Did not get the flu shot the previous year. People who don't get the flu either weren't exposed or got a shot. It ties back to survival of the fittest.
It ties back to certain variants leaving more offspring than others. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
Because if no one got sick from flu X is going to die. Viruses only live inside your body. They need your body to reproduce. They need a human host, an animal host, a bird host, a plant host. Question is, can it get worse? The answer is always yes. Can diseases evolve? Can diseases change? Can our little shots not work? Yes. So I'm going to recommend that everybody visit the CDC's website, www.cdc.gov. If you are not sure if your child needs a shot, if you're not sure what the schedule is, if you're not sure, did they get enough of the MMR? Are they supposed to get a booster before they go to college? There's actually a vaccine schedule. You can call your doctor, or you can get it at the CDC's website for vaccines/schedules. Or, when in doubt, just ask a doctor, ask a nurse practitioner, ask a surgeon, ask a biologist, ask somebody who does this for a living. Do not ask your neighbor who decided that kale was going to be the perfect healing ointment for rabies, because they're going to die. Ask someone who does this for a living. When my car breaks down, I don't ask my coworkers to fix it, I bring it to a mechanic. When my body breaks down, I ask my coworkers, how do I fix it? So, with that, any questions?
Thank you very much.